I am a widowed farmer, used to the silence of the country. But that day I saw something I will never forget. An elderly woman running desperately through the pasture while an out-of-control bull chased her. My heart raced because I knew that seconds would make all the difference. And that was when something totally unexpected happened. But before I tell you everything, I want you to comment at the end of the video what you thought of the story. Give it a rating from 0 to 10 and tell me what city you are watching from. I would love to get to know you better. There are moments in our lives when a single second makes all the difference. I was mending the fence on the east pasture when I heard the scream. My rough hands were holding the barbed wire. The sun was beating down on my neck, and suddenly that yell tore through the humid Texas morning air. I dropped everything and ran. Way down at the end of the field, between the clumps of tall switchgrass swaying in the hot wind, a tiny figure was trying to get away from something. Goliath, the meanest bull from the neighboring ranch, was charging with his horns down, the ground shaking under his hooves. My heart pounded. I wasn't going to make it in time. But then something happened that I still can't explain to this day. Goliath stopped. Just like that, suddenly, as if he had hit an invisible wall. The woman turned around slowly, looked the beast right in the eyes, and whispered something that the wind carried away before it could reach my ears. The bull took 3 steps back and turned away, as tame as a weaned calf. I stood there, breathless, and it wasn't from the effort of running. My name is David. I am 54 years old, widowed for 2 years, and I learned to live alone on this farm along the banks of the irrigation canal. The house still holds Sarah's clothes folded on the bedroom chair. I can't bring myself to put them away. I can't really explain why either. The woman's name was Martha. She had white hair pulled back with a wooden comb, hands that trembled slightly but eyes that never wavered. She thanked me for trying to help with a half smile, and just told me that animals sense when you are afraid, and she had stopped being afraid a long time ago. Then she walked away down the shortcut that borders the canal, without explaining anything else. I kept thinking about that all day. At night, lying in the hammock on the porch, listening to the constant sound of the water rushing through the dam that had filled up after the rains, I realized that for the first time in a long while there was something in the world that didn't fit into any explanation I already knew. In the days that followed, I found out that Martha lived alone in an old, weather-beaten cabin by the canal, on a strip of land that everyone knew about but nobody messed with. She could barely get around properly, as advanced arthritis had left her legs slow and aching. And then I understood with a shiver that the scene with the bull hadn't been an act of heroism. It had been the only option for a woman who couldn't have run for another 30 feet. It was Bill, my loudmouth neighbor, who filled me in on the rest. That land where Martha lived was being targeted by Richard. Richard wasn't a scary-looking man. He was worse, charming, well-dressed, attending the same church as half the county, and the owner of a growing meatpacking plant. He needed exactly that strip of land along the canal to build a new distribution warehouse. He had tried to buy the land before, but Martha refused. So he changed his strategy, starting to pressure the local county clerk's office through Kevin, his cousin and accountant, planting doubts about the documentation of her deed. I felt the anger rising slowly, like a coal catching fire in my chest. I went to the county records office the next day. The clerk, looking embarrassed, couldn't meet my eyes when he told me that one of the original property records was temporarily unavailable for review. It was clear someone was pulling strings. That was where I met Emily. She was at the clerk's office at the same time and heard the whole conversation. She was a young lawyer who had recently moved to the county, setting up her own practice. She knew this kind of shady maneuvering, and she had a personal reason not to let it slide, since her own grandfather had lost land the exact same way, in this very region 20 years ago. We started working together, but every step we took seemed to have been predicted by Richard, as if someone was leaking our moves. Until I found out who it was. Bill, my friend of decades. He had been passing information to Kevin without realizing he was being used. The discovery tore me apart. I had to cut that circle of trust off at the roots. Richard wasn't just calculating. Deep down, he was a man who couldn't stand being defied. And by putting myself between him and Martha, I became his main target. On a Wednesday afternoon, a group of men hired by him showed up at my farm. They didn't make verbal threats, as they were much more sophisticated than that. They merely inspected the fence dividing my property from the leased pasture, pointing out a supposed boundary issue. The message was loud and clear that I could lose my land too. I tried to shove one of them off my property. I hurt my shoulder in the scuffle. It was nothing that needed a hospital run, but it hurt. It hurt even more to realize that I was all alone, that I yelled and nobody came to back me up. That night, by the edge of the canal, with the loud rush of the water in the background, Martha brewed some herbal tea and told me something I didn't expect, saying she knew she was going to lose the land. She had known for a while. What she really wanted was just to have enough time to tie up the loose ends, though she didn't explain what that meant. Emily found a copy of the original deed kept in a box of records at the local parish, handed over years ago by Martha's late husband to Father Michael for safekeeping. But the priest, feeling the pressure from Richard, refused to hand over the document without a court order. Going through the courts would take weeks, and the deadline to contest the paperwork at the county clerk's office expired in 8 days. Then Susan showed up. She was Martha's younger sister living in Denver, and she came without warning. She wanted to convince Martha to sign the sale papers, truly believing in her heart that the fight wasn't worth her sister's health. Now I had to deal with a conflict inside Martha's own family while the clock was ticking. I managed to convince Father Michael to at least show the document to Emily, without handing it over, which was just enough for her to take pictures and put together an emergency injunction. It was a small victory, earned through a long and difficult conversation in the vestry. I had to be more honest about my own past than I felt comfortable with, telling him about the day I was kicked out of the regional farmers co-op because I refused to sign off on falsified reports that favored the big corporate growers. I chose to do the right thing and lost everything. Father Michael listened, and his resolve wavered. But Richard already knew what we were up to. Early the next morning, I woke up to the smell of smoke. The equipment barn on the farm, which housed the machinery I had bought with the money from the last harvest and was still paying off, was engulfed in flames. There was no way to prove it was arson. The fire took the equipment, a good chunk of my yearly income, and above all, the sense of safety I still had on my own land. I cried alone, kneeling in the dark, warm dirt, smelling of ash and burnt diesel. The next day, Martha came to me, this woman who could barely walk, and placed an envelope in my hands. Inside was the deed to a small pasture reserve that her husband had registered separately, under the name of a community association that had been inactive for years. If this association were to be reactivated with legitimate members, the land could not be contested on an individual basis. Richard couldn't just buy out an association, he would need a majority vote. I finally understood what Martha meant by tying up loose ends, as her husband had planted this safeguard years before he passed away, and she had kept it safe until she found someone she trusted enough to see it through. The final days were a race against the county clerk's deadline and against the pushback from Richard, who had by now thrown all discretion out the window. Emily, George, a retired land surveyor who knew every detail of the county's property records, and I worked around the clock to gather 5 members to reactivate the association before time ran out. Then Kevin sought me out in secret. He was feeling remorseful, not for what he had already done, but for what he was about to do. Richard had instructed him to submit a backdated forged document to the clerk's office that would retroactively void Martha's deed. Kevin didn't want any part of it, but he was scared. I needed to convince him to testify, and I had less than 36 hours. Susan, Martha's sister who had seemed like a roadblock, changed her tune after spending a night talking with Martha by the canal. She hadn't understood the fight before because she didn't know what Martha's husband had built. Now she understood, and she wanted to be one of the association members. At the county clerk's office, with Kevin present and the forged document being submitted by Richard's attorney, Emily filed the emergency petition with the photos of the original deed and the minutes of the association's reactivation, signed by 5 members including Susan and myself. The county clerk, faced with 2 simultaneous filings and with Kevin loudly confirming the irregularity of Richard's document, suspended the process and forwarded it for judicial review. Richard missed his window. The land stayed. In the months that followed, Richard lost his credit with suppliers after his attempted deed fraud became public knowledge in the county, not through the courts, but through the collective memory of a small community where everyone knows everything. He sold the meatpacking plant at a loss and skipped town quietly. Like a man leaving in shame, I rebuilt the equipment barn with the help of my neighbors, including Bill, who realized what he had inadvertently done and worked harder than anyone to make up for it. Martha started coming over to the farm for lunch on Wednesdays. It stopped being a special event and simply became the way things are now. The community association, reactivated out of pure necessity, discovered it still had a purpose, starting to organize shared access to the irrigation canal, something the district had needed for years but nobody had managed to put together. And I, who had been afraid of caring for someone with my heart instead of my head, realized a little too late, or maybe right on time, that this time my heart hadn't betrayed me. There are moments in our lives when a single second makes all the difference. That scream I heard in the pasture was one of them. I didn't just save Martha that day. I saved myself too. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.